After years of boardrooms, long nights behind spreadsheets, and the quiet but constant buzz of political maneuvering in the city, I had finally done it. I'd stepped away. I wasn't exactly retired, not in the traditional sense, but I had learned to step back without anyone noticing I was gone. That's a skill few ever master. The lake property had been in my possession for over a decade, though you wouldn't know it by how rarely I visited. It was tucked along a quiet bend on the western edge of Clearwater Shores, a sleepy, HOA-run community that had ballooned in property value over the past few years thanks to urban expansion. I had bought the land before the HOA even existed, before the paved roads and manicured parks and community bylaws crept in, like ivy around the foundations of every home. Back then, it was just me, a half-cleared lot, a tired cabin with a tin roof and the sound of loons calling across the water. And now, after nearly 8 years of leasing it out to a conservation group and using it only sparingly, I was back. The trees had grown taller, the path to the dock was overgrown with bramble, and the front porch sagged, like it too had been waiting for me. I brought only what I needed, a rucksack, a thermos, and my old dog, Murphy, who was content to sniff everything twice before circling into a nap by the fire pit. I had no plan. That was the point. No board meetings, no calls, no names to remember or schedules to manage. Just me, the lake, and the stillness I had traded so many years of my life to finally earn. I had been there maybe 3 days when it started subtle at first. A knock on the door while I was splitting kindling out, back sharp, impatient. I wiped sweat from my brow and rounded the corner axe still in hand. She stood like someone who had never been told no in her life. Mid-50s hair sprayed into submission, a pastel cardigan draped like a sash of authority. A clipboard clutched tight to her chest. "You must be new," she chirped, eyes sweeping over my cabin like it offended her. "Or just visiting." I blinked. "This is my home." Her lips twitched. "Your home? Oh, I see. Well, I'm Karen Cartwright, head of the Clearwater Shores HOA. I said nothing. The name meant nothing to me then. She went on. "I'm sure you've been given the welcome packet with the regulations, the guidelines for lakefront usage, noise restrictions, fire safety, dock permits, ma'am," I said calmly. "I've owned this land for over 10 years, long before there was a Clearwater Shores anything." That stopped her, briefly. Then came the condescending smile, the kind that said she thought she was still in control. "Well, I'm afraid things have changed. This entire lakeside is governed by the association now. All residents are expected to comply with community standards, even legacy owners." I raised an eyebrow. "Legacy owners?" She tapped the clipboard. "Meaning people like you who bought in before the bylaws were formalized. We try to make allowances, but there are still rules." I didn't say a word. Just let her fill the silence. She continued, her voice sharper now. "I noticed your truck parked partially on the communal path. And the dock you've got, it's not on file. There are procedures, paperwork. You can't just use the lakefront without permission." I nodded slowly, not in agreement, just registering her words. "I'll look into it," I said flatly. That wasn't good enough for her. She straightened. "I'll be back tomorrow with forms. We'll need to process your status formally, and a compliance review may be necessary. For everyone's safety, of course." She turned and left without waiting for a reply, her heels clicking against the gravel like a gavel slamming down. Murphy padded out from under the porch, yawning. "Yeah," I muttered to him. "This is going to be fun." That night, I sat on the dock with a glass of bourbon, watching the moonlight ripple across the lake. I remembered when I used to take my son out on that water in the early mornings, back when he was still young enough to believe I could fix anything. I sipped slowly. The air was heavy with pine and possibility. Karen didn't know me, not yet. But I knew her type. I'd met versions of her in boardrooms, campaign offices, and behind polished desks at City Hall. People who thought power was something you wore a name tag, a title, a position on a committee. But I knew better. I didn't need to threaten her. I didn't need to raise my voice. I'd dealt with governors. I'd advised mayors. I knew how the system worked, not just the rules, but the shadows behind them. This wasn't about a dock. It wasn't about a welcome packet. It was about someone who had mistaken my silence for submission. And that was her first mistake. The next morning, I was on my hands and knees clearing moss off the porch steps when I heard the now familiar crunch of tires on gravel. Murphy lifted his head from the sunspot he'd claimed by the cabin window and let out a low woof. I stood brushing dirt from my jeans, just in time to see the same woman, Karen Cartwright, stepping out of a shiny black SUV bearing a magnetic decal that read, Clearwater Shores HOA Compliance Division. She carried the same clipboard, but this time it was paired with a tote bag full of pamphlets and glossy brochures, as if she were trying to sell me something I already owned. Good morning, she called, her voice forced cheerful, in that way that people use when they're pretending they're not about to start a fight. I brought you the materials we discussed. We do like to get everyone onboarded quickly, especially our legacy residents. I stepped off the porch, nodding politely, but said nothing. She interpreted my silence as an invitation to continue. We're proud of what we've built here, she said, handing me a thick manila envelope. A thriving community with standards, safety, a shared vision. I opened the envelope just enough to glimpse the stack inside bylaws, fee schedules, parking restrictions, noise ordinances, landscaping, guidelines, dock permits, lake access, tiers. It read more like a municipal codebook than a neighborhood welcome packet. Karen pointed to a section flagged with a bright pink post-it. You'll want to pay close attention to Section 4B lakefront usage. Since your cabin technically sits adjacent to the communal shoreline, any use of the dock, the fire pit, or watercraft is subject to review and approval. I looked at her careful to keep my expression unreadable. Approval from whom? The HOA board, she said sweetly. We meet every second Thursday of the month. I gestured toward the lake behind us. That dock, I built it with my own hands 11 years ago. Hauled the lumber myself. Set the posts before the HOA even existed. That shoreline, it's on my deed. Marked and recorded with the county. She blinked. I'm afraid the board doesn't recognize pre-HOA modifications unless they've been formally grandfathered in. And since we have no record of that process being initiated, I held up a hand. Let me stop you right there. I'm not submitting a request to use land I already own. I don't need your board's permission to sit on my own dock. Something flickered behind her eyes. Not fear, not yet, but something colder calculation. She adjusted the clipboard in her arms like she was bracing herself. I'm just here to help you integrate Mr. Callahan, I said. Eli Callahan. Her expression didn't change, but her pen hovered slightly over the sheet on her clipboard. You're not listed in the association registry. I'm not a member. Well, she said, smiling tightly, everyone who resides within the Clearwater Shores boundaries is technically under our jurisdiction. I took a step forward, keeping my voice low. I never signed a CCR. I never approved annexation. And if your board is basing jurisdiction on recent plats, they'll need to talk to the city zoning office and the county registrar. Her smile faltered, just for a second. Karen was used to people folding. She was used to her clipboard and pastel cardigans being treated like badges. She'd been playing Queen Bee in her little pond for so long, she assumed the whole shoreline bowed to her. But I wasn't one of her subjects. She cleared her throat. Be that as it may, we've received several informal complaints already. Oh, I raised an eyebrow. From whom I can't disclose complainant identities, she replied smoothly. But one was concerned about your firewood pile. Another about noise levels your truck idling too early in the morning. Someone mentioned you had an unregistered vessel on the water. My canoe. Whatever it is, it needs a decal, she replied. For tracking in case of emergencies, I chuckled. Not because it was funny, but because it was so utterly transparent. You ever serve in the military, Ms. Cartwright? She blinked again. Excuse me, I asked. I repeated, if you've ever had to command anyone who didn't already want to listen to you. Her mouth opened, then closed again. I continued. Because out here, people don't follow rules out of fear. They follow people they respect. And that respect is earned, not printed on a brochure. For a moment, we stood in silence. The lake behind us shimmered in the morning sun, and somewhere across the water, a loon called. Karen recovered quickly, tucking the clipboard tighter to her chest. Well then, she said, stepping backward toward her SUV, we'll be in touch. I suggest you review the documents thoroughly. Looking forward to it, I said flatly. She climbed into her vehicle, without another word. As she reversed down the driveway, I could see her glance back at the cabin in the rearview mirror like she couldn't quite figure out how her usual routine hadn't worked. Murphy wandered up beside me and leaned into my leg. I reached down, scratched behind his ear, and exhaled. I knew people like her. I knew how they operated. They pushed boundaries not because they believed in structure, but because they got high on the illusion of control. The difference now was, I wasn't just some cabin dweller with a canoe and a porch swing. I still had strings I could pull ones she hadn't even seen yet, and soon she would. Over the next week, the quiet serenity I had returned to was gradually chipped away, not by nature, not by weather, not by the old groaning pipes in the cabin, but by paper. Notes, notices, bulletins, all slipped under my door, taped to my gate, or pinned to the front porch railing like warnings on a battlefield. Each bore the insignia of the Clearwater Shores HOA, a stylized heron curled around a pine tree pretending to look graceful while hiding its claws. Most were unsigned. The few that were had Karen's name in neat block letters at the bottom beside her tidy signature. The first one was about unauthorized shoreline maintenance. Apparently, trimming back the brambles along my own dock without prior HOA approval was a violation of Section 4C. Then came the firewood citation, non-compliant wood stacking techniques. I hadn't known such a thing existed. According to the notice, the logs posed a combustion hazard to the community. A third paper accused me of vehicular obstruction of a shared easement. That one was rich. My truck, parked exactly where it had always been, was apparently interfering with an unofficially recognized walking trail. The trail in question was a deer path. Each message came with a veiled threat. Failure to comply may result in fines, loss of lake access privileges, and additional enforcement action, all signed in accordance with community standards. What community, I wondered? No one had introduced themselves. No one brought over a pie or offered a handshake. Only sideways glances from neighbors who once waved and now barely nodded. Karen's reach was longer than I had expected, like a spider spinning influence into corners I hadn't seen. I didn't respond. Not yet. Instead, I pulled out the packet she'd given me and started to read, not just skim, but study. Page after page of standards, many of which conflicted with county codes or overlapped with city ordinances in ways that made enforcement questionable, at best. Paragraphs that repeated themselves. Clauses without legal basis. And worst of all, language that could mean anything, depending on who was interpreting it. There it was. Power hidden in ambiguity. Take Section 4B Lake Access Management. It stated that all residents utilizing lakefront facilities must seek prior approval from the HOA board for personal or recreational usage that may interfere with collective enjoyment. Who defines interference? What's collective enjoyment? There were no metrics, no guidelines, just language. Karen and her ilk could twist as needed. I found the clause referencing legacy properties vague, half-formed, lacking any clear procedural outline. Essentially, if you hadn't signed on when the HOA formed, you were still subject to its will, unless you'd filed an objection within 90 days of notification. Problem was, I never received a notification. Digging further, I found the plat maps filed with the county public records accessible online. Karen's HOA had submitted an annexation request 2 years ago to extend their jurisdiction to include parcels adjacent to the lake. Mine was marked as pending dispute. No final approval, no vote. I made a note. The next day, a new flyer appeared: HOA community meeting, mandatory for all lakeside residents. At the bottom, in bold discussion topic, non-compliant use of lake facilities by Mr. Eli Callahan. They weren't even pretending anymore. It wasn't just about control, this was a campaign. That night, I sat at the kitchen table under the flickering light of the old ceiling fan, leafing through the documents again. I pulled out a legal pad and began to take notes, but not for a defense. I wasn't preparing to argue with them. I was preparing to dismantle the foundation of everything they'd built on paper. They wanted to play politics, fine. I'd spent 2 decades advising politicians. I'd written language for bills, helped draft municipal charters, sat through zoning battles and environmental hearings with enough backdoor deals to fill 1,000 HOA binders. Karen thought she was untouchable because she had a clipboard. I still had contacts not just in the mayor's office, but in infrastructure planning, land use, and even the county assessor's department. Not to mention the private law firm that owed me a favor after I'd bailed them out of a zoning mess 3 years prior. But I wasn't going to make calls yet. First, I needed to see how far she'd go, so I waited. And she delivered. 3 days before the community meeting, I woke to find a yellow placard staked into the soil near my dock. In all caps, "Notice this dock is in violation of HOA regulations. Use is prohibited until further review." It had the HOA seal and a barcode that linked to their compliance website. My dock, my shoreline, my lake. I took a photo, then another. Then I went inside, opened my laptop, and began to write my own notice, addressed not to Karen, but to the city zoning office. I cited parcel history, annexation irregularities, and HOA overreach. I attached photos. I filed it as a formal grievance. It was the first domino. Karen didn't know it yet, but her fake kingdom had just been put on notice by the real mapmakers. The morning after I filed the grievance, I stepped onto the porch with a cup of black coffee and a sense of calculated calm. The lake glimmered with the same quiet majesty as always, but something in the air had changed, a tension you could feel like humidity before a storm. Across the water, I saw movement. 2 neighbors, a middle-aged couple from a few lots down, Carl and Heather, if memory served, were walking their retriever along the tree-lined path by the shoreline. They'd always been friendly, especially Carl, who used to wave as he kayaked past my dock. Today, he saw me slowed and looked away. He said something to Heather, who nudged the dog to keep moving. No wave, no smile. A fluke, maybe. But then it happened again. Later that afternoon, I went into town for supplies, fresh bread, propane, a new reel for my fishing rod. I ran into 2 other residents from Clearwater Shores at the general store. One of them, an elderly man named Jerry, looked up, recognized me, and offered a stiff nod before immediately turning to inspect a shelf of canned beans with exaggerated interest. The other woman, someone I didn't know by name, but had seen tending a lakeside flower bed, turned her cart sharply down a different aisle. I wasn't imagining it. By the time I got home, a second notice had been pinned to my gate. Failure to comply with current HOA lake use policy may result in daily fines of up to $200 per infraction. Signed again. Clearwater Shores HOA Compliance Division, this time with Karen's name bold and underlined. That evening, I pulled out my old binder of contacts and began leafing through the printouts. I'd kept hard copies of county policies, HOA law loopholes, and grandfather clause case studies. The pile of research was growing, but I still hadn't made a move beyond that formal grievance. I was collecting data, letting the dust settle, or rather letting it stir. Then came the HOA community meeting. I hadn't planned to attend. I figured my presence would only feed the circus. But curiosity got the better of me. I dressed in my usual jeans, a gray flannel shirt, boots still dusty from splitting wood. Nothing fancy, just me. I arrived early and sat quietly near the back of the community center's meeting room, which looked more like a converted church hall than a place for government business. Folding chairs were arranged in rows. A cheap plastic table at the front held a bell, a pitcher of water, and a mic that squealed every time someone cleared their throat near it. Karen stood at the center, commanding the space in a navy blue blazer and a string of pearls that seemed more costume than elegance. Her hair was immovable, her tone rehearsed. She greeted the crowd with forced cheerfulness. "Thank you all for coming. As always, our focus is the safety and unity of Clearwater Shores." A smattering of claps, a few murmurs. I sat still. After going through several mundane topics, trash collection adjustments, dock permit renewals, garden club volunteers, she cleared her throat again and looked down at her clipboard. "I do want to raise a point of concern regarding non-compliance issues on one of our lakefront lots. It's come to our attention that certain residents may be disregarding community rules, particularly in areas related to shared resources and lake safety." She didn't name me, but everyone knew. I felt the heads turn. She continued. This is a reminder that all residents, regardless of property acquisition date, are expected to adhere to current HOA policies. Legacy status is not an exemption. There it was. A shot across the bow coded in professionalism, but pointed. I didn't move, didn't react. But a few people glanced at me, some with curiosity, some with discomfort, and some, a rare few, with something close to pity. I saw Carl and Heather again, sitting closer to the front. Heather refused to turn around, but Carl met my eyes just briefly before looking away. Karen ended the meeting with a familiar phrase, "Compliance ensures community." I left before the rest of the chairs scraped back. The following day, I found Murphy growling at a new sign hammered into the ground near my mailbox. This one read, "Notice, due to outstanding infractions property at 117 Lake Bend Drive, is now subject to HOA administrative review." I laughed out loud. The desperation was beginning to show. She was escalating. That night, I made 2 calls. The first was to a land use lawyer I'd worked with a few years back during a legislative fight over shoreline erosion setbacks. She picked up on the second ring. "Eli Callahan," she said. "Wow, I didn't expect your name to pop up again." I told her the situation briefly, cleanly, professionally. She agreed to look into the annexation filings and cross-reference them with the original deed. She sounded almost excited. The second call was shorter. A number few people had, and fewer still used. The mayor's personal line. He picked up after 1 ring. "Callahan," he said, and I could hear the smile in his voice. "Thought you were off the grid." I replied. "But someone's trying to build a fiefdom on my shoreline. Thought you should know." His tone shifted. "Tell me everything." By the time the moon climbed high above the lake that night, I had already started connecting dots, not with emotion, not with vengeance, but with the same quiet precision I had once used reviewing city budgets and regional infrastructure proposals. That part of me, the strategist, never really retired. I wasn't going to barge into HOA meetings yelling about injustice. That would only validate Karen's narrative that I was a rogue problem to be managed. No, I intended to dismantle the entire structure she thought protected her brick by bureaucratic brick. I started early the next morning. Coffee brewed strong, Murphy snoring under the table. A notepad opened beside my laptop. The first thing I pulled up was my original deed, filed 15 years ago. Notarized, registered, and clearly defined in language that hadn't aged a day. My parcel included 148 feet of lake frontage. It was marked private use only, with explicit exclusion from future easement encroachments. And more importantly, it was dated 3 years before Clearwater Shores HOA even existed. Then I downloaded the HOA's Articles of Incorporation and the 501c4 registration documents, because yes, even they had to file with the IRS. What struck me immediately was their annexation timeline. Their bylaws claimed they had unanimous consent for expansion into the surrounding lots, a legal requirement in this state, but I never received a notice, let alone signed consent. I flagged that. Then I reviewed their board elections, past rosters, open seats, voting results. The same names popped up every year. Karen had been acting president for 6 of the past 8. The HOA was a closed loop, no contested ballots, no minutes from actual debates, no documentation of community votes on major policy changes. I flagged that too. Next came the budget. Now this part made me smile because I had seen this game before. I once exposed a regional school board that had hidden over $2 million in discretionary maintenance reserves while pleading poverty to parents. The HOA's filings were sloppier but no less revealing. They collected monthly dues that far exceeded what they spent on community services. In fact, nearly 30% of their annual budget went to compliance enforcement. What does that even mean? I searched further. They had contracted a private code enforcement firm, one that was owned, it turned out, by Karen's brother-in-law. The contract had been renewed annually without bid. Another red flag. As I jotted notes, I kept reminding myself, don't act yet. Let her keep walking into her own trap. 2 days later, I got a formal letter from the HOA. Unlike the notes and flyers, this one was on official letterhead, delivered certified mail. Karen was getting serious. The letter cited ongoing violations of HOA policy, including unauthorized dock maintenance, failure to register a watercraft, use of a non-HOA compliant fire pit, lack of lawn conformity to community aesthetic standards. They gave me 10 days to submit a remediation plan, or the board would initiate lien procedures against my property. A lien on my property for using my canoe and chopping wood. That's when I pulled out the old blue file folder from my Army days, the one labeled Civil Asset Rights. Private land. It had everything: precedence cases, county code books, and even letters from a few attorneys I used to consult for free when they were still in law school. I wrote up a formal response, not emotional, not aggressive, just factual. I stated that my property was never lawfully annexed into the HOA jurisdiction due to failure of written notice and absence of recorded easement consent. I cited the parcel number zoning classification and quoted exact language from the HOA's own articles showing that I was excluded unless I voluntarily opted in. I then addressed the lien threat directly. I referenced Fowler v. Lakeside Meadows HOA, where the state court ruled that retroactive enforcement of HOA guidelines on properties lacking original covenant consent constitutes administrative overreach and is void under land use law. I sent it by certified mail, CC'd to the HOA board, and just for good measure to the city's planning and zoning office. The next few days were quiet. Too quiet. Karen hadn't stopped, I knew that much. She was regrouping, probably consulting someone, maybe even trying to contact a local attorney. But she'd find the same thing I did. Her position wasn't half as secure as she believed. What she didn't know, however, was that I had already looped in someone far above her pay grade. Mayor Prescott. He and I went back years. I helped him strategize his first city council run when no one believed a former teacher could unseat a developer-funded incumbent. I didn't ask for credit, never wanted it. But I did earn something more useful: loyalty. When I told him what was happening at the lake, he didn't laugh. He just said, "You want me to make a call?" "Not yet," I replied. "Just be ready. I might need a visit." He chuckled. "Well, you've always liked a dramatic entrance." And he was right. Because if Karen wanted a show, I was going to give her one with the mayor, the city zoning official, and possibly a news crew in the front row. But not yet. Not until she made her final, irreversible mistake. I had hoped Karen would come to her senses. I really had. There was still a part of me, small and fading, but still present, that believed people backed down when the truth stared them dead in the face. But Karen, she wasn't built that way. She didn't blink, she didn't reassess, she doubled down. The morning it happened was a Saturday, one of those perfect spring days when the lake looked like glass and the pine trees whispered with wind. Murphy and I had just come back from our usual morning walk when I saw the white SUV parked across the edge of my driveway. Not blocking it outright, but just enough to make a point. Karen stood beside it, clipboard in hand, dressed in a lime green windbreaker like she was headed to a nature hike. Except the look in her eyes was all business. Behind her, two men I'd never seen before stood near the dock, both wearing matching HOA-branded polos and radios clipped to their belts. One held a tape measure, the other a digital camera. I felt the chill creep down my spine. "Morning, Mr. Callahan," Karen called, as if this were a friendly visit. "What's this?" I asked, my voice already tight. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Routine property inspection. In response to unresolved violations. I left notices multiple." "I never consented to an inspection," I said flatly. "And you're on private land." Her smile widened. "According to the updated boundaries and compliance maps, this area is now subject to shared governance oversight." I took a step forward, planting my feet in the gravel. "You're trespassing." She held up the clipboard like a shield. "This is perfectly legal." The board voted to conduct an inspection after receiving credible complaints. And since you failed to attend the last two meetings because your board has no jurisdiction over this parcel. Karen's expression didn't falter. "That's debatable." And in the meantime, we're obligated to document any safety hazards. I turned to the two men. You work for her. They exchanged a glance. One of them, the older of the two, shifted uncomfortably. We're just contractors, sir. Then you'll want to stop taking pictures of my dock before I call the sheriff. Karen's voice sharpened. We've already filed preliminary lien documentation with the registrar's office. Further obstruction will be noted as non-cooperation. That did it. I stepped between her and the cabin, pulled my phone from my back pocket, and began recording. You're on video, I said. State your name and reason for entering this property. Karen hesitated. This is unnecessary. I didn't lower the phone. State it. She turned to the contractors. Gentlemen, step back to the vehicle. They did quickly. One muttered an apology under his breath. Karen looked back at me. Her posture had shifted, the confident tilt of her shoulders now pulled inward. You're making this more difficult than it has to be. No, I said, stepping closer. You are. You brought strangers onto my property. You lied about your authority. You've ignored legal filings, and now you're going to walk off my land and not come back unless it's with a court order. There was a moment, a crack in her armor where I thought she might back down. Then she said it. We'll see how you feel when we block your dock access. We've already submitted the request to reclassify the easement path. That wasn't just overreach, that was war. She had no right legally, morally, or procedurally to tamper with an access point that had been recorded as private property in county records for over a decade. But she was betting on intimidation, on my silence, on her ability to outlast and outpaper me. She had picked the wrong man. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't threaten. I just pulled out my second phone, the one most people didn't know I carried, and made one call. Mayor Prescott picked up on the first ring. Eli. He said, voice casual, is it time? It's time. He exhaled, like he'd been waiting for this moment. You want a statement? A visit or both? Both, I said. She just brought personnel onto my land without consent, and she's filing false easement claims. Give me 90 minutes. I hung up and looked Karen in the eye. You should stick around. She tried to recover. You think calling in friends is going to you'll want to hear what he calls me. Karen blinked. Just once. But it was the first real crack I'd seen in her. She turned stiffly and marched back to her SUV. I stood at the edge of the dock for the next hour, Murphy at my side, the sun high and blinding on the water. I didn't move, and then I heard it, tires on gravel again. But this time it wasn't a clipboard-carrying bully or a couple of part-time security guys. It was a city SUV, the seal painted on the side unmistakable. The door opened, and out stepped Mayor Prescott in his usual gray blazer and worn loafers, flanked by two staffers and a zoning official. Karen emerged from her car mid-step toward them when Prescott looked up, grinned, and said loud enough for every soul near the lake to hear Morning Boss. You didn't say it was this bad. Karen froze, completely. Her mouth opened, then shut again. She looked from me to the mayor, to the zoning official, now rifling through documents on a clipboard that actually meant something. It was over. She just didn't know it yet. I didn't plan to speak right away. That wasn't the point. The point was the silence that fell across the lakeside like a thunderclap after the mayor called me boss. Not sarcastically, not jokingly. With the casual weight of someone who understood precisely who he was talking to and wanted everyone else to understand, too. Karen stood frozen still, halfway out of her SUV, her clipboard limp in her hand. It was as though someone had yanked the batteries out of her and left her standing mid-sentence. I let the moment sit. Prescott approached me, shook my hand firmly, and turned to look out over the water. Still as peaceful as I remember, he said, nodding toward the trees, was, I replied. Until they started thinking they could redraw maps and fabricate power. Karen finally found her voice. Mayor Prescott, I wasn't aware you would be making a personal visit. He turned to her, still polite, but his expression was steel-wrapped in civility. You should have called before escalating to property inspections, he said, especially when the property owner is a landholder with tenured legacy rights and verified deed protections. Karen stiffened. With all due respect, we followed procedural protocol. The HOA has full jurisdiction over the expanded parcels. Incorrect. Prescott cut her off, not unkindly. Your annexation is pending and has never been formally certified. The registry still lists Mr. Callahan's property as exempt from HOA jurisdiction due to his refusal to sign covenants. That makes any enforcement action you've taken here unlawful at best, criminal at worst. You could have heard a pine needle fall. Karen's mouth opened, then shut. Again. The zoning official stepped forward, flipping through a manila folder. According to the parcel logs, parcel 334CLB, that's this address, remains under independent designation. No binding CCRs, no recorded HOA obligations. Dock structures are compliant under shoreline construction codes dated back to 2009. Prescott folded his arms, and any effort to obstruct access to that dock or file liens or conduct further inspections constitutes harassment. I didn't say a word. I didn't have to. Karen tried again. There have been multiple resident complaints. We were just responding in the interest of community safety. Community safety doesn't give you the right to fabricate violations, I said, finally stepping beside the mayor, nor to threaten private citizens with invented fines, nor to send unlicensed contractors onto land you don't control. Her face flushed. This is highly irregular, she muttered. Prescott's smile didn't falter. What's irregular is the fact that your HOA board hasn't had an open election in 4 years, that your brother-in-law owns the enforcement company you're funneling dues into, that you've been collecting fees from properties you don't legally govern. Karen turned pale. The zoning official held up a document. We'll be issuing a cease and desist order effective immediately. Any HOA enforcement activities targeting Mr. Callahan's property must stop. Karen clutched her clipboard tighter. You can't just, you're lucky we're starting with a warning, Prescott interrupted, his voice low. I could have brought county legal counsel. Karen didn't reply. She simply climbed back into her SUV and started the engine. No eye contact. No parting words. She drove off like someone trying to outrun their own reflection. The mayor turned to me. She'll push back, you know. People like her don't retreat easily. I'm counting on it, I replied. You want me to take further action? He asked. Media, legal, not yet, I said. I want her to feel the floor tilt first. He chuckled. That's the Eli I remember. We stood together on the dock for a moment, just watching the lake. He clapped a hand on my shoulder. You know, I used to think you'd never leave the game. I didn't, I said quietly. I just picked a different arena. He nodded, then turned and walked back to the SUV with his staffers. The zoning official stayed behind a few moments longer, handed me a carbon copy of the cease and desist letter, and gave me a nod of sympathy wrapped in respect. As their vehicles pulled away, I leaned back against the porch rail and let the silence return. The birds picked up again slowly, as if unsure the coast was really clear. Murphy trotted over and flopped down beside my boots. I scratched behind his ears. That's one phone call, I said. Let's see how long she lasts before I have to make another. The next morning, my mailbox was empty. No flyers, no warnings, no notices. But that didn't mean it was over. Because when bullies lose control, they don't admit defeat. They panic. They double down. And Karen Cartwright was about to learn that the lake doesn't answer to paper queens. It didn't take long for word to get around. By Monday, the quiet nods and sideways glances from my neighbors had shifted into something else entirely. Curiosity, confusion, and in a few brave cases, cautious respect. One of the lakefront owners, a widower named Dennis, whom I hadn't spoken to in years, walked over that afternoon with a 6-pack of beer and a sheepish expression. Heard you had a visitor, he said, tipping his head toward the driveway, where Mayor Prescott's SUV had idled just days earlier. I shrugged. Old friend, just catching up. Dennis chuckled, opened a can, and said nothing more. But he stayed for an hour, sipping and watching the light fade over the water, with a kind of silent gratitude, as if my presence and the mayor's had rebalanced something none of them had been able to name. I didn't gloat. That wasn't the goal. But I knew the effect it had not just on Karen, but on the community. Karen, of course, didn't disappear. Her kind never does. She just went quiet, at least for the moment. No more paper notices, no more strange men with clipboards. But something was brewing behind those HOA curtains. I could feel it in the emails that started circulating. They weren't sent to me directly, but they found their way to my inbox anyway, forwarded by residents who had started to question things. Subject lines like emergency board meeting agenda unavailable and clarification needed on parcel boundaries. She was regrouping. But now she was bleeding support. And then 2 days later, Prescott returned. This time it wasn't just him. A city press liaison accompanied him along with a representative from the county property assessor's office, and surprisingly, a local journalist from the Clearwater Gazette. They arrived mid-morning, parked cleanly along the access road, and strolled toward my porch with the casual assurance of people who knew they had every legal right to be there. Karen must have gotten the alert. I didn't see her car, but I saw the curtains twitch at the HOA office, a converted lakeside building they'd dubbed the Community Resource Center, which was little more than a glorified storage shed with air conditioning. Prescott waved to me. I offered coffee. The journalist declined, but only because he already had a cup from the cafe in town. He looked younger than I expected, early 30s, but sharp. "So what's the story?" he asked, flipping open a leather notebook. I didn't speak right away. Instead, I let Prescott explain carefully, diplomatically. He laid out the facts: illegal HOA annexation filings, forged enforcement letters, unregistered inspections, and the attempted lien against a property with standing deed protections and no covenant obligations. "This is more common than people think," he said, looking toward the camera that now stood mounted on a tripod. "Small HOAs overextending authority, assuming everyone will roll over. But this time, they picked the wrong man." The journalist nodded, scribbling. "And the mayor calls you boss." I smirked. "I used to serve in city infrastructure planning." Prescott was my intern when he was still a schoolteacher running for council. Prescott grinned. He helped write the zoning language that founded most of Clearwater Shores. I wouldn't be mayor without him. That part made it into the story. Front page the following Sunday. HOA Power challenged local veteran site's illegal overreach at lake property. Mayor intervenes. Karen was not quoted. What followed was a slow public unraveling. The city released a formal statement announcing the revocation of all pending HOA annexation requests related to lake parcels, citing procedural inconsistencies and lack of transparency. The assessor's office launched an audit into HOA finances, and within a week, the enforcement contract with Karen's brother-in-law was suspended pending investigation. A special vote was called to re-elect the HOA board. For the first time in years, multiple residents ran, and Karen wasn't among them. The new president, a retired nurse named Alma Ruiz, knocked on my door with fresh-baked bread and a sincere apology. "We didn't know," she said quietly. "Some of us suspected, but..." I nodded. "I understand." She looked out toward the water. "You staying?" "For a while," I replied, "until the place feels like it belongs to people again." The next morning, Karen's SUV was gone. No one saw her leave. No goodbye. Just silence. Later, I heard through a friend in the zoning office that she had withdrawn from all civic committees and sold her house to a young couple with no interest in HOA politics. Her legacy, if she ever had one, dissolved into a line item in a neighborhood audit report. And me, I finally sat on the dock again. No signs, no tape, no citations tucked into my screen door. Just Murphy snoring softly beside me. The lake calm and bright. The pine trees no longer whispering warnings, but resting in the quiet they had always known. I wasn't just a homeowner. I was a reminder. That silence is not weakness. That knowledge is power. And that sometimes the best revenge isn't loud. It's a name spoken by a mayor in front of the right people at the perfect moment. "Boss," he'd said. She froze, and everything changed. You could almost feel it, the slow, deliberate turning of the tide. Like the moment a storm breaks and the air tastes different, heavier, cleaner. That's what Clearwater Shores felt like in the days after Karen disappeared from the community board emails and stopped leaving notices taped to people's doors. Her departure wasn't dramatic. No final showdown, no apology, just absence, and with it a slow unraveling of the fear she had cultivated for years. What surprised me most wasn't how fast things changed, it was how quickly people admitted they'd always wanted them to. Neighbors who once avoided me now waved first. Carl, the man who used to look away during HOA meetings, dropped by with a box of tools to help me fix the rusted latch on the shed behind the cabin. He brought his teenage son, too. Said the boy needed to learn how to work with his hands. You knew all along she was bluffing, Carl said, as we worked in the late afternoon sun. Didn't you? I knew she didn't have the foundation, she claimed, I replied. But I didn't know how many of you felt the same way. He nodded slowly. We just thought pushing back meant war. Fines. Foreclosure threats. None of us had your kind of leverage. Sometimes I said it only takes one person calling it what it is. Nonsense. For the whole illusion to crack. The illusion had definitely cracked. Alma Ruiz, the newly elected HOA president, held an open forum in the community center a week later, the first truly public unscripted gathering Clearwater Shores had seen in years. No one was shouted down, no one was ignored. She let people speak, even those who disagreed, and I watched from a seat near the back as neighbors aired grievances that had been festering under Karen's rule, unexplained fines, backdated policy updates, the silencing of residents who weren't in her social circle. Alma looked tired by the end of it, but honest. When someone asked if the HOA would be dissolved, she said simply, "Not yet. But we're rebuilding it from the ground up. The right way this time." I respected her for that. She even asked me privately, over coffee one morning, if I'd consider sitting on the new advisory council. Just once a month, she offered. You wouldn't even have to speak. Just be there. People listen when you're in the room. I smiled but declined. I think I've made my impact. She understood. Instead, I offered to help her restructure the bylaws, quietly, behind the scenes. I didn't want recognition. I just wanted the next person who moved here, the next Eli Callahan, to not have to fight the same war. Murphy and I returned to our routine. Morning walks, chopping wood, fishing off the dock in the late hours when the lake turned pink with sunset. For the first time in a long time, I let myself believe that peace might be something permanent, not a pause between battles. But the shift wasn't just personal, it was systemic. The county released findings from the audit a month after Karen's exit. Her brother-in-law's company had been collecting inflated fees for years. The HOA board had failed to conduct proper elections since 2018, and multiple compliance actions had been carried out without documented votes or legal basis. Fines were issued, funds were reimbursed. Legal proceedings began, not criminal, but enough to make it clear that Clearwater Shores had become a case study in overreach. I got a letter from the Gazette requesting a follow-up interview. I never answered it. The story had already been told. Instead, I focused on the people around me. A new couple moved into the cottage down the road, young, idealistic, eager to raise their kids away from city noise. I helped them unload furniture one morning, and the husband offered me a cold soda, saying, "You're the reason we picked this place. Heard things are different here now." I just nodded. They are. Every so often, I'd see Karen's old house from the ridge above the lake. It sat quiet for a while before the new owners moved in, a family with 3 dogs, 2 paddleboards, and a fondness for stringing lights across their back porch. They painted the trim, removed the fake security cameras Karen had installed, and they waved every time they saw me. I waved back. The HOA, now rebranded as a neighborhood council, focused on hosting monthly cookouts, park cleanups, and kayaking workshops for kids. The rules still existed, but now they serve the people, not the other way around. And my dock's still there. Still mine. No warning signs, no inspection tags, just wood water and peace. Sometimes I'd stand at the end of it, toes brushing the edge, and think about how close I'd come to walking away. How easy it would have been to sell to let them win, to retreat into quiet bitterness. But that's the thing about bullies, they count on silence. They thrive in the space between fear and fatigue, and that's where they lose. Not in a courtroom, not in a headline, but the moment you stand your ground and refuse to be pushed anymore. That's when the power shifts. Summer came slowly to the lake that year. The trees budded in patient green, the frogs returned to the edges of the shallows, and for the first time in what felt like a decade, Clearwater Shores exhaled. There were no sudden knocks at the door, no pastel flyers slipped under porch railings, just morning sun drifting paddlers and the kind of silence that wasn't suspicious, just real. I started waking up without the coiled readiness in my gut, the one you carry when you expect trouble to arrive dressed as politeness. Murphy seemed to notice too. His steps were lighter on our morning walks. He stopped bristling at every passing car. That was peace. Not the absence of noise, but the absence of tension. One afternoon in early June, I sat in the folding chair at the end of my dock with a journal in my lap and a glass of iced tea sweating beside me. I wasn't writing anything important, just thoughts, memories, odd fragments of conversation I didn't want to lose. That's when Alma arrived. She didn't knock. She called from the shoreline. Permission to board, I waved her over. She walked the dock in flip-flops and a linen shirt, her hair loose for the first time since I'd met her. She looked younger, freer. I brought you something, she said, holding out a folded piece of paper. I took it. It was the final revision of the new Clearwater Shores Charter, shorter, cleaner, and more humane. No blanket annexations, no unenforceable compliance articles. Most importantly, a full page on homeowner rights, consent, and due process. You wrote this part, didn't you? I asked, pointing to the clause about property grandfather protections. She smiled. You inspired it. I read it again slower this time, then folded it carefully and tucked it into the back of my journal. You did good, I said. We all did, she replied. Eventually. We sat in silence for a while, watching the sun sink into the far side of the lake. Somewhere across the water, children laughed, and the smell of grilled food floated on the breeze. Alma reached into her bag and pulled out a single photo, one taken at the last community event. It was a group shot, families, retirees, young couples, kids on bikes, and dogs everywhere. I stood at the far left, barely in frame, holding a paper plate of barbecue and talking to the mayor. You belong in this? She said, handing it to me. I didn't argue. I tucked the photo into the journal beside the charter. Later that evening, I made one final call, not to the mayor, not to zoning, but to an old friend of mine, a teacher who ran a local veterans outreach group just outside the county lines. Ted, I said when he picked up, how do you feel about hosting a community legal workshop? Something about HOA rights, homeowner protections, all that good stuff. He paused. I've been waiting for you to ask. 2 weeks later, Clearwater Shores hosted its first ever public seminar on HOA law and homeowner advocacy, open to anyone, not just residents. Over 70 people attended. A few came from 3 counties over. And me, I just sat in the back next to Murphy, sipping coffee and watching as the work echoed forward into places I'd never intended to reach. Because sometimes justice doesn't come in courtrooms. It comes in calm waters, in neighbors finding their voice, in bullies being quietly, completely unseated, in legacy being rewritten not by force but by patience. The day Karen left, she took with her the illusion of control. But what she left behind was something better. A community worth staying in. That fall, the leaves burned red and gold. Alma hung string lights across the park entrance. The new council planted apple trees near the walking trail. Kids built rafts and raced them down the creek. And no one checked for decals. Clearwater Shores wasn't perfect, but it didn't need to be. It was home. One evening, I stood alone at the end of the dock, the water glass smooth beneath the stars, and I whispered the words I'd been holding on to since the day Karen first knocked on my door. This is mine. Not in the sense of possession, but in presence, in having stood when it mattered, in having stayed. Murphy nosed my leg and sighed contentedly. We turned and walked back toward the cabin. Lights on, doors unlocked, peace not handed down by any board or vote or ordinance. Peace on my terms.